As we've mentioned already, the situation in Russia had been seething and simmering for quite some time. The straw that broke the camel's back was an almost complete breakdown of Russia's transportation system, which had been withering since the war started and that had suffered terribly in the winter that had just happened. Russia almost couldn't handle its transportation needs in peacetime after several years of war. There were whole cities that were not receiving enough food. One of them was the capital, Petrograd. Petrograd used to be called St. Petersburg, but when the war started, that sounded a little too German, so they changed it to Petrograd. This is a city that will change its name all the time. During the communist years, it will be known as Leningrad. Now it's St. Petersburg again. Nonetheless, it's the big metropolis, and it doesn't have enough food. You take a bunch of people who were angry already, add the war, add no food. It's not surprising they were marching. They'd been doing it all throughout 1917, as Irish historian William Mulligan points out. Quote, "From the beginning of 1917, there was a wave of strikes, concentrated in Petrograd. On the 7th of March, 30,000 workers were locked out of the Putilov armaments plants in the city. The following day, International Women's Day, women gathered in the Vyborg working class district to protest against high bread prices. They marched past Finland Station toward Nevsky Prospect, by which time the strikers numbered 100,000. Down with the war! Down with the high cost of living! Down with hunger! Bread for the workers!" they cried as they marched through the city. The protesters connected their experience of war with much broader political claims. Although the crux of their complaints was the food supply crisis, this material experience of war had political implications, including the overthrow of the Tsarist regime and an end to the war. It was possible, in theory, that the food supply system could be reformed, but the strikers knew the Tsarist regime could no longer reform itself. End quote. British General Sir Henry Wilson went to Russia during this time period and came back and reported to his peers, concerning how the people in Russia felt toward the Tsar and Tsarina, and told them, quote, "It seems as certain as anything can be that the Emperor and Empress are riding for a fall. Everyone, officers, merchants, ladies, talk openly of the absolute necessity of doing away with them. They've lost their people, their nobles, and now their army, and I see no hope for them. There will be terrible trouble one day here." End quote. There are open discussions amongst some at the higher levels of Russian society that terror attacks should be made against the Tsar. Someone stands up at the Duma, an important person later in this story, and says that the Tsar needs to be removed by terrorist means if necessary. Now, it would be foolish to say that the royal court did not have their supporters. They did. And they had people who didn't have a problem with an emperor, but they had a problem with Nicholas II. So there were all stripes in this idea that the Tsar needed to go, and no consensus at all about what would take its place or how to get from here to there. Russia knew how to have protests and to revolt. About a dozen years before this time period, they had the famous 1905 revolution, which had also come after, Russian problems in a war. When that revolution broke out, it got so serious the Tsar supposedly wrote out his abdication letter. He didn't deliver it, but it was ready to go. In that particular revolution, the crowd marched on the Winter Palace where the Tsar was to a line of troops who opened fire on them, killing hundreds of them. It's known as Bloody Sunday. The Tsar had received intelligence reports a few months before this event saying that, quote, "Recently, the conviction has been expressed without exception that we are on the eve of great events in comparison with which 1905 was but a toy." End quote. That was from a police report that the Tsar received months before these demonstrations in March break out. Now, here's the thing. As with many historical events, they can be seemingly inevitable for the longest time and still come as a surprise when they actually show up. The people who were out in the streets March 7th, March 8th, which was International Women's Day, they didn't know that this is the revolution. In fact, the people on the scene point out that that's one of the tipping moments in this situation when people understand, wait a minute, this just isn't another demonstration like the kind we've been having. This is the chance to topple the government. That's the big turning point. And the actual moment of the turning point is one of those really interesting, almost turning point in history moments. Revolutionaries like Leon Trotsky, who certainly see it that way, spend a lot of time talking about that moment, the tipping point in the revolution. This is 7 days, by the way, folks, 7 days for a 300-year-old dynasty to fall. And it starts off with some factory strikers on March 7th. By the way, this is our calendar. These events in Russia happen on the old calendar in February, so it's often called the February Revolution, and it makes the dating confusing as heck for someone like me. Nonetheless, March 7th, by our calendar, 1917, there's an industrial strike. March 8th, it's International Women's Day. The women go out and strike and protest about the lack of bread and all this. This seems to be key, and so many people talk about it, the fact that the women are doing this. A lot of these women are the wives of soldiers at the front, which gives them a huge amount of credibility, as you might imagine, with other soldiers. And they're out on International Women's Day on the 8th. On the 9th, the women come back out, bring more people, and go to factories and shops and businesses and grab the workers out and have them join the strike. And the crowd swells to at least twice what it was the day before. By the next day, the industry of Russia's capital is paralyzed. And to show you how out of touch the Tsarina is with all this, she writes in her diary on March 10th, about the troubles in the capital, and she's basically in charge in the capital, quote, "This is a hooligan movement. Young people run and shout that there is no bread simply to create excitement, along with the workers who prevent others from working. If the weather was very cold, they would probably all stay at home. But all this will pass and become calm if only the Duma will behave itself." End quote. The Duma is the Russian legislature, which I think I said earlier has about 1% of the power in this system, and the Tsar has about 99%, and the Tsarina is complaining that the Duma is misusing its 1%, sort of. Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky compares her pretty convincingly to Marie Antoinette before the French Revolution. That's a let-them-eat-cake statement there. And she and the Tsar, and before he died, Rasputin, liked this one Russian minister, a guy named Protopopov. And so he begins to sort of act as the Tsarina's minister in all this situation. And according to some on the scene, it's anger at him that prompts a lot of this activity. The events that are happening, starting really on March 8th and then March 9th, are large enough to be a big news story, and the international media is there. There are magazine journalists, there are newspaper reporters from Britain, France, places like that, telling the folks back home what's going on in the Russian capital. One is a British newspaperman named John Pollock, and he writes about the women protesting. He calls them bread riots. He writes, and this is about March 8th, and my apologies for my Russian pronunciation, quote, "The rioting was so far confined to the Vyborg side, the chief workmen's quarter of Petrograd. But in the center, the tramway service had already become irregular. On the 9th, the rioters stopped the trams across the river, terrorizing the drivers and throwing parts of the mechanism away, so that the service grew still more intermittent. Visits were paid to all the factories, and the hands were called out in sympathetic strike against the sudden food shortage. On this day, too, a prefect of police who threatened the crowd was killed. Strong Cossack squadrons patrolled Petrograd, and there was a collision on the Nevsky, in which the Cossacks used their whips. But they told the crowd that they would not shoot so long as they only asked for bread. Alarmed at the attitude of the Cossacks, the authorities on the 10th brought troops of the line into the streets to support the police, posted machine guns on the Nevsky, and stopped traffic across it at many points." End quote. John Pollock then points out, it sounds like a rumor, but what the Russian minister working for the Tsarina is supposed to have said when his methods for dealing with this uprising are being questioned. Here's what Pollock writes. He says, quote, "Protopopov, approached by one who endeavored to convince him of the madness of his methods, only answered, 'Do you know how splendidly machine guns work from the roof?'" End quote.